This is part 3 of lecture 7. In the previous two parts, we talked about convolution and some special filters that's used to get special types of features. And here I want to introduce you to two of the important feature transforms that are used to generate features from images. And the first one is called Sift. It's used very often in computer vision, and it stands for Scale Invariant Feature Transform. So basically what this does is it takes the pixel intensities and then it transforms these intensities into actual features that we are going to use in machine learning. So what are some of the properties that we want? We want the features to be invariant to, say, location and, as the name suggests, scale, orientation, and maybe lighting. So what I mean is, suppose we have two images, and in the first image, you have a big cat. And in the second image, maybe you have a small cat facing another direction. Then when you compute a feature in this region, and when you compute a feature in this region, they should look the same. So the feature vector should not depend on where this object is, what scale the object has, what direction it's facing, and also the lighting. So it may be light or it may be dark. So these two, basically, we want them to generate a similar feature vector. So a feature vector is, remember, is a vector of numbers representing that region, basically. So the problem is how we're going to do this mathematically, and there are complicated formulas to do this, but instead of doing it this way, let me show you a diagram first, and then we will talk about the mathematics. I cannot draw these things, so let me just use someone else's image. For example, the fish here. Okay. So suppose we are interested in the region here. Then it contains 16 pixel by 16 pixel. And for each pixel, we can compute a gradient. So we will have the gradient x and the gradient y. So for each pixel, there are basically two numbers. And if we treat these two numbers as a vector, then we get a vector like this, with this is the x gradient, this is the y gradient. If we plot these things for every pixel, we will get an image like this. And there are too many values here, so we want to combine some of them. So what we usually do is we break this region into 4x4 smaller regions, and in each small region, we would add up these gradient vectors in like one of 8 main directions. So let me actually show you a very, very simple example. So suppose we have only 4 of these, and 3 of them are facing the same direction, and 1 is facing the other direction. Then the way to get these things is just to add them up. So the first one, and add up the second one, add up the last one, and in another direction, I just start with another direction. So all of these are generated by basically adding up the gradient in this smaller region, which we call a cell, and we add them up in a group of basically 8 different main directions. And the next step would be just calculate the length of these things. So suppose we actually have this. Then suppose we don't have anything in the other directions. Then we can write these lengths in order. So suppose starting from the gradient going to the right, then 0, this looks like very long, and let's say 3, and then 0, and then the other direction is say 1, and then 0, 0, 0, 0. So we would get a feature vector corresponding to the length of the sum of gradients. So now we have basically 8 features, and we have 16 cells. So for each 16 by 16 region, there will be 128 features. So now this seems like it is location invariant. If you put this in another location, it will look the same, but it seems it's not scale invariant and also not orientation invariant, obviously. So let's fix a scale problem first. So the way to fix scale is actually very simple. We just scale up the image and calculate the feature the same way. So what we are going to do is we have the original image, say like this, and then we get an image that's half the size, and then we get an image that's quarter of the size, and then 1/8 of the size. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the same 16 by 16 window on the smaller image, on the smaller image, and so on. So instead of scaling up these gradient windows, we are going to just scale down the image. And a structure like this is called an image pyramid. And we would construct an image pyramid at the beginning, and then we would do these 16 by 16 gradient sum stuff after that for all of these different scales. So that's how we fix the scale problem. And the orientation problem needs to be fixed as well. But maybe before that, let's look at the formula first. So here we covered most of these problems, and the only difference is when I add up these gradient magnitudes, so the length of the gradient, when I add them up, I didn't weight them by a Gaussian function. So it turns out so the features will be better if we weight them using a Gaussian function. And here it's basically choosing a specific value for the sigma for the Gaussian function. That's one difference, and everything else is basically what I just explained, adding the magnitude up and grouping them into 8 different directions. And there are 128 features in the end for each region. Okay, so now let's figure out how to do this so that it's orientation invariant. So the algorithm is actually very simple as well. So we're going to just figure out the dominant orientation, and we're going to just rotate these features by the dominant orientation angle. So let me show you another image. Let's say this one. I don't know where to place this. I should have an empty slide, but I forgot. In any case, so we had this region, we had this 16 by 16 region, and the majority of the gradient are facing in one direction, and we're going to call that direction the dominant orientation. So what we're going to do is we're going to rotate everything in this region by that amount, so that the dominant orientation of all different regions are facing the same direction. So basically, if you have a fish looking like this, and if you have another fish looking like this, if you look at that region, the dominant orientation, say suppose it's going up, then the dominant orientation of this one will be going that way. But if we rotate so that the dominant orientation are facing the same direction, then they will look the same. And basically that's how we're going to deal with the orientation problem. So there are some specific problems with using the same gradient to compute the dominant orientation, like one of those 8. So we're going to change this slightly. We're going to have 36 beams. So basically 36 different directions instead of 8. So remember, we had only 8 different directions here, and now when we are choosing the dominant orientation, we're going to use 36 different possible directions and group these gradients into one of these 36 beams. And then we also use a Gaussian function with a slightly different sigma, and after we calculate these gradient sums, we find the angle, basically one of the 36, that corresponds to the largest sum of gradient magnitude, weighted by this Gaussian function, and then we call that the dominant orientation. And then we rotate all the gradients in this region by that amount. So the reason why these numbers, like the sigma and the beams, are chosen is because they tried it on different data sets, and these sets of numbers work great. So I guess there's no mathematical reasons why they're chosen like this, but empirically, given real life images, these numbers are chosen specifically for this Sift feature. Okay, so that's orientation invariance. And the last one we talked about is invariance to lighting. So basically illumination and contrast invariance. So that's actually very easy to fix. We're just going to normalize it. So for each 128 dimensional feature, we are going to just divide each one by the sum of these magnitudes, so that the sum will be 1. So then we can compare the 128 dimensional features for different regions, because for all of these regions the sum will be 1, so it's kind of the scale will be the same. And sometimes we also use a threshold of 0.2, so everything that's less than 0.2 will be made 0 in this feature vector. Okay, so there is a big problem with this. Sift features, they are really difficult to compute. So we don't actually want to compute it for like every region. So ideally what we want is we want to do it for this region, this region, this region, and also for a different scale, we want to do the same set of regions. But it turns out that Sift is kind of hard to compute, and we don't really need like the features that are invariant to all of these things. So Sift is usually not used to compute features for machine learning algorithms. And I will introduce another one that is actually used for machine learning algorithms called HOG. And yes, before I move on to HOG, I do want to talk about what Sift is actually used for often. Sift features are usually computed only for a small number of points, and these points are called key points. So suppose you have an image like this, then there are some special points that we want to compute the features so that we can get a smaller set of features. And these points are usually computed by finding the local maxima and minima of the Laplacian of Gaussian of the image. So remember, we talked about this filter, and now here is why they are useful. So basically, for each pixel, we compute the Laplacian of Gaussian. So basically, we convolve this image with that log filter, or the dog filter, actually. And then we get the Laplacian Gaussian of each pixel. And then suppose we find a pixel, and all the pixels around that pixel has a lower value, then that pixel would be a local maxima. And then we would use that as a key point, and we would find the Sift feature around the region of that key point. And similarly, if we get a pixel like here, and all the points, all the pixels surrounding that pixel have a larger value of Laplacian of Gaussian, then it would be a local minima, and then we also use this as a key point. So I guess that's all I want to talk about Sift. And at the end, I will talk more about how to actually use these features in computer vision tasks. But here, let's move on to the thing that I mentioned, Hog. That's actually computing the features that are useful for machine learning algorithms. So Hog here stands for just histogram of oriented gradients. And the computation is actually very similar to Sift, except for we are not going to calculate the dominant orientation, so it saves a lot of work. And also, we are not going to weight them by the Gaussian function. So it's just directly summing up these gradient magnitude. So it's basically what I explained in the diagram for Sift, but we are not just not adding any scales to those things. We just directly add them up. And there are other smaller differences, like we are going to use 9 different orientations, and we're going to normalize within a block of 4 cells. So again, these numbers, these parameters are figured out by actually trying these things on specific image data sets. So there is no mathematical, theoretical justification for these. They basically just work. So these are some of the parameters that's actually used in the Hog features. Since the Hog features are faster, easier to compute, what we're going to do is for image, we are actually going to calculate the Hog features for the first region, for the second region, third region, and so on. So basically, this maps to a feature vector, this maps to another feature vector, and then we combine all of these, we'll get a very long feature vector for an image, and then we have our label y. So suppose we want to classify whether an image contains a human face or not human face, then we have a bunch of training set that are already labeled. 1 is face, 0 is not face, and we are going to use these Hog features as the features in training something like a support vector machine. Then we can compute these Hog features for new images, and then use the support vector machine that we trained to classify whether the new image is a face or not a face. So it's in the next page here. So here, Hog features are computed for every cell, and then it's used as actual features for support vector machines. And it turns out in practice, Hog feature plus SVM is actually a good combination to do face classification. So basically classifying whether an image is a face or not a face. And we talk about Sift features are not actually used to train these classifiers. What they are used is they are used to match objects in multiple images. So let me actually show you an example of that. So here I did not show you this image earlier. So in this image here, we are just computing the Sift feature for these selected points that we called key points. And let me actually show you another image here. So what we do here is we find these key points in the first image, and we find the key points in the second image, and then we try to match the feature of these key points. So for example, for this particular key point, there is a feature vector that's 128-dimensional Sift feature vector, and then we find the vector that's the closest to this vector in the other image. So maybe it's that one here, and we use a line here to connect these, and then we do the same thing for all different features, and then we get these lines, and then we can figure out that maybe this part of the image is the same as this part of the image. So that's how we basically find objects inside the image using the Sift features. So again, they are used for matching, not actually used as features for training some machine learning algorithms.